Okay, well, I think we'll have some more folks trickling in, but I will get started. Welcome to this 1-hour training session on B3 guideline updates. So for those that are not AIA credits, we will provide basically to the attendee list a certificate of completion, which my understanding for engineering and other disciplines is sufficient for self-certification of credit hours. But we have AIA and we have the certificate of completion is typically what we put out for these, and that's what we'll do for this session. Okay, again, as I noted, B3 guidelines updates training session, and this is relevant specifically to a set of updates that is intended to support small and constrained site conditions. And I'll get into kind of where this fits into the other broader guideline updates as we move forward through this. As you may have already noted, I'm keeping an eye on the chat. The attendees are muted, but I will keep a lookout for questions that come in for that, and I'll let you know when I'll take a more detailed look at questions. Okay. The agenda today, just a couple of housekeeping items at the start. I'll give an introduction to why we're here, what the session is about, and then do a overview of the updates. This is not an overview of the overall site and water section of the guidelines. This is an update. This is a discussion specifically around those areas that are being updated. The timeline of those updates, including how this fits with other updates that we've processed recently, and then the applicability and the specifics around what qualifies as a smaller site versus what qualifies for a smaller site, depending on which guideline you're looking at. We'll also talk about the increased clarity in defining a site, potentially what we call secondary sites, and then deep dive into specific guideline updates. And I've highlighted throughout this document those areas that have been updated. I'll also flag some upcoming training and other program notes, including one that's coming up quickly in June that my colleague Rolf, who's also on this, will be doing for life cycle assessment. Again, questions, please let me know what comes up as I'm talking through in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will attempt to answer what I can of those. Okay. We're going to record this session, and it'll be posted on our B3 training page, where we essentially post all of the online trainings that we do. Again, please drop your AIA number into the chat if you need AIA credit for today. The way that we have these set up is attendee mute, and we use the Q&A and the chat function to field questions. And I will leave time at the end of each guideline that I go through, and at the end of the overall session for what questions come up. So the general, and this is kind of the 30,000-foot view of guideline updates for B3, are intended to bring these standards, bring these guidelines up to date with the other efforts in this area. Also to reflect the current state of the building industry in Minnesota. So essentially looking at the capacity of the design and construction marketplace to determine what is feasible in terms of more aggressive sustainable strategies. We're also keeping an eye on what the administrative burden is for project teams, because we want to have a higher impact process, but one that doesn't get bogged down in essentially kind of moving paper around. And overall, this to improve the sustainable performance of these projects moving forward. So that's the overall intent, the overall kind of overarching way we look at the guideline updates process. We're also, if you look at the diagrams at the bottom, looking where possible to move from relative and prescriptive approaches into performance-based approaches, understanding that there's a balance to be held there, sometimes with prescriptive approaches and what may be considered more or less burdensome in terms of documentation, in terms of modeling or evaluation. So there's a balance there, but in general, we like things that are more performance-based or more metric-based and less prescriptive. We're also intending to harmonize the effort between B3 guidelines participants and the design practice, rather than having things kind of in opposition or kind of clunkily forced together. So that's what we're trying to diagram out in the bottom right. We also look at the overall B3 universe as a feedback loop. And so because we have a connection to the projects that are running through the program, we can take the information that is gained from those program participants and use that to feed this guideline update process, because we are a local program, and we do listen to the feedback that we're receiving from project teams, both in the specific update process, but generally as we work with project teams that are proceeding through the guideline program. So we have kind of a B3 overall feedback loop that we engage in, but we've also seen that work at the firm and the project level, where the understanding about the metrics that are associated with B3 help improve things at those more granular levels, and are intended to clarify and make visible what would potentially previously be invisible for project performance. The timeline of the guideline revisions, because this sits as the most recent of a set of guideline updates. We first came out with B3 guidelines in roughly 2004, which was built out of a Hennepin County effort in the late 90s. Early aughts, there was version 1.1, 2.0, and 2.1. 2.1 was when the tracking tool, the online tracking file, came and replaced what was previously a Excel workbook that was passed around by project teams. We were expanded to include major renovation projects in 2009. Version 2.2 came out in 2013. Version 3.0 came out in 2017, which was the largest update to the overall process, and saw the number of phase submissions, for example, winnow down from 8 to 4, trying to really streamline the process that teams would go through to submit for the guidelines. Version 3.1 was for projects in 2019, and I included the most recent update to the site and water section, notably for today's discussion. Version 3.2 included an energy atmosphere update, was for projects that began pre-design on or after January 1st, 2020. And then we put out a first revision to guideline version 3.2 in 2021 that was intended to accommodate small buildings specifically. So this is in part a carrying on that work of looking at the lowering the burden for kind of more limited projects, but doing so at a site scale rather than a building scale. The building scale we did previously in 2021, we are now looking at that relative to smaller sites. And then trying to unpack the complexity about what a smaller site actually entails. So the goal specifically for the smaller site revisions updates is to better accommodate and differentiate between small sites with limited opportunities and those sites with greater capacities for addressing the intent and the objective of the guidelines. And so we have the intent and the objectives that are present in and throughout the overall guideline, the overall set of guidelines, but specifically, how do we look at smaller versus larger projects relative to site areas and site engagement. This is again, I noted this complexity here, and I will spend some time in the next couple of slides to address those different kind of areas of complexity relative to the three big kind of scoring areas of the program. So We have the SB 2030 program, which is related to how much energy a project uses and setting energy targets for projects. We have the B3 small buildings method, which is related to kind of the broad set of building related guidelines. And then we have what we're presenting today, which is the small sites method, which is really about what you're doing in engagement with the project's site. And so there are three essentially different ways to look at smaller versus larger projects in these three different categories, because you might have a building that has a large amount of area and uses a lot of energy, but only has a very small amount of area that is very intensely occupied. And so that would be potentially a large building under our energy requirements, but a smaller project under indoor environmental quality and other kind of building occupant related issues. And that building may or may not have a large amount of site area that they are working with, which would impact how they are looked at relative to smaller or larger project site areas. Again, please let me know what questions pop up. With this, I am keeping an eye on the chat. Okay, so just to step through this, the B3 guidelines, small building method, and again, this is B3 guidelines as differentiated from the SB 2030 program. B3 guidelines, again, is the broad building related categories, and the SB 2030 target is specifically related to energy efficiency and energy target setting. So for the B3 guidelines method, we are looking at a 20,000 square foot threshold for gross building area of conditioned space. And there is a kind of a gray area that would need to be discussed if you have spaces that are not regularly. Apologies, my audio may have dropped out. Can folks hear me? Okay, now, has it, okay. What is the last point that audio was functional for? Okay, sounds like I'm okay, but for some reason it popped off. Okay, so the small buildings under the B3 guidelines category is, right, 20,000 square feet is the threshold for that, but we are looking to exclude spaces that are essentially not regularly occupied and are used for things like inactive storage. We had some projects come through the program that really had I think a compelling case to make that they have only had a very small area of intensely occupant related space and larger areas of space that essentially nobody was in much of the time, and that is a case to make take a more nuanced look at what we consider to be space contributing to this 20,000 square foot threshold. So if you have a small office and a large warehouse, large inactive warehouse, and even if that warehouse is 50,000 square feet, but your office area is 5,000 square feet, that may be considered as a small building under the B3 guidelines program. For SB 2030, we take a slightly different look because we are looking at that for energy efficiency specifically. So SB 2030 small building method, we have a process in place that is intended to alleviate or limit the amount of time that folks would need to energy model their buildings. But we have a different, and we also use a 20,000 square foot threshold for that part of the program, but we take a different view relative to space that may use energy but may not be intensely or regularly occupied. And so there's a table here of what those different thresholds look like. So you can see here that if you have conditioned space that's regularly occupied, that would be included both for SB 2030 and for B3 guidelines. If you have unconditioned space, you would not include it for either program. But if you have conditioned space that's not regularly occupied, you would include it for SB 2030, but you may not include it for, you might not include it for the SB2 or the B3 program, the B3 guidelines program, because it's space that uses energy, but space that we're not applying the kind of more specific occupant related guideline categories towards. So those are building related. That's between 30 and B3 guidelines, and I wanted to just touch base with that, because then when you think about sites, that also looks a little bit different. So for small sites, these updates include a differentiated thresholds for guideline applicability. So previously we had we were looking at site disturbance or renovated impervious area, which combined the area under the building footprint and the area outside of the building footprint as the number that we looked at relative to whether guidelines would be required. We're moving to doing this relative to kind of two tests. One for guideline S2, which is listed at the bottom, which is whether there's 5,000 square feet of land disturbance or 50 cubic yards of cut and fill, including the land within or below the building footprint, because that's related to stormwater management primarily. Other guidelines look at 1,000 square feet threshold, which is pretty small, but 1,000 square feet threshold, but excludes the area underneath the building footprint. So if you have a site that you're cutting into just to the extent of the building footprint, with only kind of minimal other work, the guidelines such as vegetation management, et cetera, would drop out because you are not engaging kind of more thoroughly with that project site. Understanding 1,000 square feet is pretty minimal, but we also wanted to specifically exclude things like ADA connection and utility tie-ins from contributing to that amount, because we've understand that some projects have had a building with very minimal additional site effort, except for the tying in of accessibility and the tying in to utilities. This applicability by guideline, here this may be a bit difficult to read, but I want to just highlight that most of these are based on how much site excluding the building footprint, so how much site outside of that building footprint is being disturbed, with the exception of S2, which looks at the area including the building footprint. The items in gray here are those that are essentially building related. They're in the site and water category, but they are related to the building and not the site. Those were picked up in the previous small building updates, but I do have, as part of the deep dive here, just a reminder of the bird safety guideline. So again, that's the bird safe portion, and then the indoor water portion were previously included in updates. So for moving forward with this set of updates, because this is a revision to a current guideline set, the projects that have access or are using version 3.2 of the guidelines currently will have access to these updates moving forward. We're looking to roll these out in the fall, the guideline, the tracking tool updates that accommodate these. The projects that are currently kind of midstream are currently in version 3.2. The intent is not to make anything more difficult for projects that are already halfway through designing according to the to version 3.2 of the guidelines. So I think there's only a very kind of narrow set of circumstances that could be seen by a project team, is that with this guideline update that they would need to do something additional they had not already planned. If you think that's the case, please reach out down the line and we can work through that. Our intent and our kind of guidance for this is that we're not making things more difficult halfway through the design of a project. And one of the reasons why we tie projects to the version of the guidelines that they start with at pre-design is so that they know what the lift is going to be for meeting the guidelines, and we're not trying to change things halfway through the process. So this is intended to provide essentially a set of clarifications and some more nuance in terms of applicability, but it's not intended to require projects to do something additional. All right. So for the guideline updates specifically, I'm going to go through the definition of project sites, highlighting the areas that have changed, go specifically guideline by guideline to discuss these in more depth. And then I will just underline note for this entire presentation is that I have trimmed down much of the guidelines text. Be aware that there's other guideline information or other guideline detail that is not present here. And I'm actually going to drop into the chat a link to the PDF of the red line if you've not seen it already. And this is the red line that was sent out in March as we asked for comments. And it represents the kind of most currently updated version of our updates. I want to send this to everyone. All right, so you should see a PDF link from me in the chat. All right. Okay, so definition of project site. Much of this was previously noted, but the intent is that there's kind of a couple of different ways that you can establish or define a project site. The first and kind of most straightforward one would be to use the property lines of the site to determine the project site. But we understand that several B3 projects are on a larger campus or on a larger plot of land that they're not doing that they're not disturbing to the extent of the property boundaries, and it doesn't make sense to score them relative to the overall project site if what they are engaging with is a much smaller area. So the second way to establish the project site is to include at least the area disturbed as a result of the construction activities of the project. Sorry, I got a note from another colleague on this. So the area that we wanted to provide some kind of additional clarification to and expand the definition is with respect to what we call secondary sites. And secondary sites are, if you have a larger campus to work with, you have a larger area of project to work with, you can meet the requirements of B3 and meet the requirements of what we consider to be the primary site, which is that site that is defined by the limits of the construction activities, by other efforts on that larger area, by essentially expanding your project to include, tagging those other areas and doing things in those other locations that meet the overall guidelines. One example we like to use is if you have a, let's say you're a Minnesota State project and you have a large campus to work with, and you have a building, and you, for programmatic reasons, don't want to include pollinator-friendly plantings right next to your building entrance. Those can be located elsewhere in the project site as part of that project, and will meet the B3 requirements in doing so, and lets you have some flexibility in terms of where you are locating your essentially bee-friendly landscape. So that's the intent of those kinds of that kind of flexibility. Still meeting the guidelines, but doing so in a way that that looks at a broader site. We included, and again, I've tried to highlight here the language that has been updated. The ability to use, in particular, larger stormwater management systems to meet the B3 guideline requirements. So you can consider the project to be your project site plus a piece of the campus or regional stormwater system. The constraints or the limits to that are making sure that there is essentially adequate capacity at those downstream systems to meet the B3 guidelines, in addition to all other existing requirements that are present for that downstream system. So if you've got certain limits that you have present for the watershed, you need to be able to document that you can meet B3 on top of those existing limits. So you can't essentially double count the performance of the system relative to the other requirements present on that system and the requirements that you'd see under B3. And that's what is highlighted in the last bit below. Okay, so that's the overall kind of site definition. Again, no questions have come in yet on the chat, so I will proceed. For guideline S1, and this is where you start to see that differentiation present in what we are looking for relative to overall site area disturbed or overall site area disturbed minus the area under the building footprint. That for guideline S1, the site and water connections are looking at that area that you are disturbing, but is outside of the area under the building footprint. And this is plant network connections, animal network connections, and human system connections. Just listing out the guidelines, broadly here, without hopping into specific guideline language. And so the update present here is really looking at the different applicability threshold. Guideline S2, there's a few more detailed updates present here. This is the one that looks at both the area under the building footprint and the area outside of the building footprint to determine whether these stormwater requirements are needed. So this is a larger threshold. This 5,000 square feet rather than 1,000 square feet, which is still fairly small, but looks at it, everything that you're kind of cutting into the site. Guideline S2D is indoor water consumption. So that's related to whether the project has fixtures as part of it, or if it's new construction, it has water fixtures. So specifically on guideline S2A, we did modify down here the percentage of the site water that is needed to be infiltrated on site for type A soils. Previously, this was at 100%. We've had several projects come through and note that that is a significant constraint relative to the perimeter conditions of sites. So if you've got a driveway or a small driveway or other area that you have tipped away from the site and does run off the site, if it's at the property boundary, if you're getting 96, 97%, it's very difficult to make the additional bump up to 100% unless you're trenching and doing some kind of perimeter engagement, which bumps up against limits of soil disturbance and other things we have present in the guidelines that's intended to limit and manage the overall site engagement. So we saw a little bit of conflict here between several different areas, and sometimes a heavy lift relative to feasibility. And so we tuned that down to a 95% threshold. And this is coming out of MIDS. So this is using the mostly the MIDS tool to figure out how much you are, for their baseline weather event, what portion of that water is going to different areas of the site. We also flagged that lowering the evapotranspiration number, that's for type D soils. That was higher previously. We've dropped that a bit, and that is intended to pick up the heavier lift than we initially believed it was for putting things to evapotranspiration. I'll make a note here, and I have it noted at the end as well, that we are also digging into providing better documentation or assistance in calculating evapotranspiration rates, because they're being kind of more conservatively applied in the MIDS calculator with tree boxes and some other systems, and we think that there are some other well-documented calculation methods for evapotranspiration numbers that can be added essentially on top of the MIDS calculation that can be used to hit these targets, because MIDS is fairly conservative in what it assumes for evapotranspiration numbers. And we do look at this as a real significant opportunity to pull water from overland flow, and for these type D soils, these harder soils, and want to give folks the opportunity to document that out. So that is an update that is coming, not present here today, but we are looking at pulling some prior guidance for evapotranspiration rate calculations. There is a question in the chat. Is there any consideration given to an urban area development and the expectation or difficulty of meeting a 30% infiltration target for C-type soils, given the limited site area typically available? Under the current approach, there's not a, I mean, you're seeing what is present here for the sea soils limits, and this guideline is looking at kind of the overall stormwater impact that includes that area of the building plus the area outside the building program. So we looked at that sea soil amount as being potentially some lift, but achievable in a lot of the circumstances. So that was one of the reasons why you're seeing more limited numbers for those type sea soils. Okay, moving on. So for that's the rest of S2A. So this is for watershed connections. And I have this here because we've provided some clarity on exactly how to figure out whether you are within the uplands or the lowlands of a watershed district. And I have that some version of that in these slides in a couple of slides from now. So this is one area where the guidelines have potentially increased and would be if a new project came in under version 3.2, they'd see a additional effort required rather than a project that is kind of midstream moving forward through the program. But that's only if they're present in a floodplain, and that they would be required to. It's recommended currently that they are excavate and remove a volume of soil from the floodplain at a 1-to-1 ratio to offset the volume of the added structure. So essentially to hold harmless the amount of volume that's able to be held by that floodplain by the construction activities of the project. Under S2A Part 4, that's the bottom line here, we initially had runoff curve number requirements needing to match the pre-settlement. It's been noted as several projects come through that there's technical limits to doing that unless you are willing to do a more extreme kind of remediation of the site effort. We moved that from looking at runoff curve numbers under S2A Part 4 to looking at matching 2 and 10-year storm events for the native soil conditions. So doing a pre-settlement 2 and 10-year event match for this runoff rate and runoff coefficient for the 100-year storm event for the pre-development. And so this is looking at both applying a pre-settlement condition for the 2 and 10-year and a pre-development condition for the 100-year. Okay. Additional information available for the upper and lower watersheds. This is listed in the guideline updates. Again, I posted the PDF of that red line document in the chat previously. That includes kind of more specifics that are not listed here, but it gives some additional guidance on how to consider things, whether relative to uplands or lowlands of the watershed. And that this piece of the guidelines is intended to identify those areas that are useful for aquifer recharge, and to, whenever possible, take advantage of those opportunities for aquifer recharge to get that water back into the aquifers through these project sites. And so we have listed out specific receiving bodies for these different watersheds, and then what the different height boundaries are for what should be considered to be uplands or lowlands of those watersheds relative to those receiving bodies. And okay, so that's guideline S2. I'll pause here if there's other questions. I'm also going to, because we have one of the authors, Peter McDonough, now in the chat to see if he's got comments on the prior question from Keith about type C soils. And I'll note this in the chat. Again, if there's questions on S2, let me know. All right, not seeing any, I'll go ahead and proceed. For guideline C soil, this is one that looks at the area excluding the building footprint and how much essentially engagement you have with the area outside of the building, outside of just under the building. And there's a couple of kind of minor updates. Oh, okay. And yeah, so specifically on urban soil, so this is under Part I, S3I, urban soil requirements. Just to note that we ask for the U of M soil analysis request sheet, which is typically lawn and garden, like even a homeowner lawn and gardener could get an NPK test from them for that. So it's a pretty straightforward test. It's not very expensive, and it's intended to kind of capture the condition of that topsoil. We're fine if that comes in from another laboratory, provided it gives the same outputs, because that's come up a couple of times that if you've already engaged with soil soil testing, you may want to just have that done as part of that. I'll just note that we're also joined by Peter McDonough today. So he's had a little bit of trouble getting in, but he's also on the panel today.
Pat, would you like me to address the 30% infiltration rate?
Sure, if you'd like to.
So type C soils and the request for having a 30% infiltration rate is to use all available space outside the building footprint, including the parking lots. So there are many different technologies available for infiltrating that amount of water through pervious paving, underwater cisterns, etc. So that's the idea of that. And of course, if somebody was to put a green roof on top of their building, they could get a variance on that over the infiltration, because that would be taking evapotranspiration, would be taking water offline. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, moving forward with soils. One piece here that is a more significant clarification is the expected amount of communication to the DNR. On our initial version of this, we had not well matched a few DNR processes that are in place, including the county biological survey moving to the natural heritage information system setup. And another piece here is the kind of native plant community lists. And so this clarifies the planting lists if you have a atypical soils present on the site. And so this is atypical soils that are for a native plant community. And so this is, looking at some DNR kind of available publicly posted information to find out if you have atypical soils, and then if you do, flagging those, delineating them, and making sure that you're not disturbing those soils, during or post construction. This is just being cautious with those kind of more precious atypical soils that are present in some areas of Minnesota.
I can add that if you're on the web soil survey, you'll be able to find the exact soils mapped for your site. And you can use that as the starting point, as a desktop starting point for making a determination about whether those soils, atypical soils, might be present. Thank you.
And this is the National Soil Survey website that you're talking about, the GIS tool.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. Thanks, Peter. We also clarified post and pre-development soils. We think folks have a decent handle on what, if the soils have been heavily disturbed as part of prior activities, but we wanted to be a bit more clear about what we consider to be pre and post construction. So this definition plus a longer definition are both present in the updated guidelines. I'll note that we've got 15 minutes left, and we are at S3, so I think we're doing pretty good with time. But again, I will keep an eye on the chat for questions that come up. For vegetation, the big one here is noting additional qualifying criteria is looking at that non-building footprint site area disturbance. Specifically on, so that's the extent of the update on S4, right? We're just looking at same guidelines, but different applicability criteria depending on how much area outside the building footprint that you are engaging with. Similar updates for guideline S5, although this is the guideline that also has bird safety in it. And so bird safety is really are you putting glazing in a building? And the site animal habitat support items are related to the non-building footprint site area. So you'll see some different applicability criteria present here between those bird safe requirements and those requirements that are related to non-building guidelines. And again, I will note the bird safe update here because it's site and water, even though it was previously updated as part of the small buildings updates. Under S5G, we previously had requested that if you are within a mile of Minnesota state rare plants, animals, or NPCs, native plant communities, or other features determined by a natural heritage review, that the project team would create a protection plan for those species. One thing that we dropped out of that protection plan was the requirement to have a interpretive sign identifying the rare species. It got pointed out by several folks through this process, and as we've had these guidelines up and running for a bit, that there is a downside to having identification of potentially rare plant and animal communities, and that is that collectors of those species may, essentially bad actors may use that information to gather potentially rare, valuable plant species. So there is some benefit to having kept secret the location of plant and animal communities. So that's why the interpretive sign has dropped out, is because the benefit of edification of site occupants to what native plant communities may be present there, native animal communities may be present there, is outweighed by the downside. We also improved our what we're asking project teams to get from the DNR in terms of information, and previously we had noted this as pulling information from the county biological surveys. We've switched that to, and I've communicated this with many project teams via email and some kind of interim updates, but asking them to submit the Natural Heritage Information System review, which is a process that the DNR charges. It's like $100 to $200 to do, and gives you an idea about what the plant communities that are within a certain shed of your project site are. A couple notes on this. We understand that some teams have been seeing some delay in getting that information back from the DNR. I have reached out to them and been told to expect better turnaround moving forward because of some updates that they're doing to their overall platform and processes in the DNR to better respond to those inquiries. We've been seeing a lot of projects going through, and because of the delay in getting this information back, proceeding with provisional variances to keep the projects moving while they're waiting for this information, and we see that as a perfectly reasonable approach. But if you have a project coming through and you know you're going to need to pull the NHIS information, I'd suggest getting your request in sooner rather than later, so that the clock is ticking and your project site's not likely to change. So having that in, we think, is a useful thing early in the project, in the design process. But we hope to see that. I've been told to expect that timeline to decrease moving forward. For animal habitat provisions, and this we understand is a non-trivial lift for some projects, we dropped out the water requirement for project sites under an acre. So no need to have a continually year-round available water feature on the site. And then looking at diminishing that for the larger, over 40-acre projects. One piece here, and I have this noted at a subsequent slide, but I'll just note it while I'm on this slide, is that we're also looking to bump up the maximum here because there's a conflict that some teams have identified between having these shallow, year-round accessible water features and the fact that year-round water features typically need an aeration or a water-moving device that doesn't work well at those more shallow levels. So you may see the maximum level here bump up a bit to accommodate the actual use of an aerator or other piece of equipment that would be needed to keep this as accessible year-round. So that's a subsequent update that we don't have covered yet today, but I expect to see some clarity around that by the time this guideline set is finalized in the upcoming months. Again, this is a previously updated guideline, but the bird safe related guidelines, and that's SA through S5A through S5G, now have a small building version of them, provided that you don't have any traps present in your project. Again, a trap is a see-through area that's less than 20 feet that birds can kind of see outside to outside through, and that you see a large number of bird strikes in those types of areas. So there is a table that gives you a window to wall ratio and a threat factor for that specific window to wall ratio. We also updated the critical bird habitat definitions because we had kind of a combined critical habitat for sites to avoid and sites that are critical sites relative to bird safety. Realized that was imprecise, so we have now a critical bird habitat definition, which triggers a higher level of bird safing need, because we think that those are the areas that birds are more likely to be running into. This is what that S50, or S50, not zero, S50, which gives you a threat factor, average threat factor for glazing for not critical bird habitats and for critical bird habitats. And just as a general note for threat factors, if you have glazing or applications that you don't have a threat factor for that has not gone through the tunnel testing, let me know. We've done some essentially estimates based on available information to give a approximate threat factor that could be useful for glazing that may look a lot like glazing that we have tests for, so that project teams aren't tied into just that limited number of fritting applications that have testing for. Also, we've seen the increased presence of films and other exterior applied systems that can be combined with other glazing as it's a essentially after the fact application that both achieve a pretty low threat factor because they're exterior applied and birds can see them more readily, and don't as much constrain glazing selection. So those are both kind of present, and we've seen some project teams using them to hit their bird safety thresholds. Other upcoming updates, and I've noted a couple of these as we were proceeding through, but I'll be expanding the evapotranspiration calculation guidance. Again, the water feature depth we think is a constraint. We need to do a little bit more work to figure out if that should be increased to allow for aerators or other equipment to be present in those continually accessible water areas. And then we also got a note, which was useful as feedback from these revisions, that including additional historic context would be useful, particularly around indigenous communities and other kind of what is a clear look at, what could be gained from a historical view of project sites. Peter, you're off mute.
Yes, Pat, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about the water feature. And one of the concerns that I had heard back was concern that there was a place for active mosquito breeding. And Dr. Nancy Reed at Mosquito Control found that if there's a permanent water feature deeper than 12 inches, predators of larvae of mosquitoes will live in those locations, primarily frogs, etc. And so that is a concern, but it's not, research has shown that it's not something to be concerned about. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. We've got an upcoming training session. I'm not sure if you're on mic, Rolf, but do you want to give a kind of a brief outline of the June sessions? I should have warned you that I was going to ask you to do this.
I'm here. Yeah, we've got upcoming sessions. These are actually repeating sessions that we ran in December of 2021 on life cycle analysis. So there will be two separate sections or sessions. The first one will be kind of a general background on what LCA is, how it's used within the B3 guidelines, and paths to meet the requirements. And then the second session will be a bit more in depth, kind of more of a training session where we'll use the LCA calculator called Athena to meet some of these guideline requirements during the class, essentially. So yeah, and it filled up last time. So that's why we're running this again. It seems to be quite a popular session. There's some need for it. So sign up.
I dropped a link for that in the chat. Just to note that the training session is not capped, but the workshop is. Is that correct?
Yes, the workshop. Yeah. The second session is capped at 20 people.
Yeah, and we post the training, but not the workshop, because the workshop is interactive.
Right. The first session will be recorded and uploaded to our training site to view later, but the second session will not be recorded, right?
Yep. Right. Again, we have got a training site that we post these trainings on. This is just some recent ones that we've put up there. Case data database is a useful spot to look for project information for projects that have previously gone through the program. And then just flagging here our project partners, Wildan, CEE, LHB, Martin Guerin Design Research, and our sponsors, the Minnesota Department of Commerce and the Department of Administration. And I'll hold here for the last questions. It is 2 minutes to the hour. So question from the chat. If we have a project that would benefit from modifications to the site and water guidelines, we have to wait for the final version rollout estimated fall, as mentioned, to be able to apply these updated requirements. So we're proceeding with this as the almost finalized guidance. And so the projects that are kind of midstream right now that would benefit from this can apply this moving forward, but we'd have to do so in a way that manages the existing, not yet updated tracking tool. Projects had done this for the small buildings updates as well, where we managed to work with project teams to apply these updates before we had this kind of fully programmed out in our tracking system. So yes, you can proceed with this moving forward, but will be kind of clunky with the technology in the interim.